In this session, I want to talk to you about Noah's flood washing away millions of years. You know, we look at the world that we live in, and we drive along the freeway and we see road cuts, or we go on a family vacation out to the Grand Canyon, and we see those layers there, and we have to ask the question, when and how was all of this formed? How did these layers of rocks get there? Well, the evolutionists have told us that this rock layer represents the history of the development of life on this planet, starting with very simple creatures at the bottom of the rock record, and then as we come up through, we see creatures evolving into different kinds of creatures, and the evolutionists say that this timeline represents about 3.5 billion years. And that is what most people believe today. But is that the correct interpretation of the rocks? And what does Noah's flood have to do with washing away millions of years? Well, Noah's flood is absolutely critical to this question of the history of the earth. And if you study the writings of people who believe in an old earth, most of them ignore the flood. All they look at is Genesis 1 and try to figure out how to fit millions of years into Genesis 1, but they ignore the flood. But the flood is absolutely critical to this question of the age of the earth. So I want to talk to you about the flood, first explaining some of the biblical evidence and then looking at the rocks and the fossils. There are 4 views of the flood that have been held in church history. The first is the historical global catastrophe view. Every one of those words is important. This view says the flood was historical. It happened in time-space history. It was global. It covered the whole planet, so there was no dry land anywhere when the flood reached its highest point. And it was a catastrophe. It was a flood of unimaginable catastrophic destruction. Now that view was the universal belief of the church for 18 centuries. But in the early 19th century, when the idea of millions of years was born, that view began to be rejected, and it was replaced by some other views. One view was that the flood was a historical, local catastrophe. It really happened in time-space history, but it was localized in the Mesopotamian valley of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, modern-day Iraq. And it was just described in Genesis in exaggerated language. Other people said, no, it was a global flood, and it was historical, but it was a global, tranquil flood. It was so peaceful that it left no geological evidence, and therefore we don't have to try to harmonize the flood with the geological record. Now actually, a global tranquil flood is an oxymoron. As they would say in the South, there ain't no such thing as global tranquil floods. In fact, there's no such thing as a tranquil flood. All floods are destructive. All floods erode material from one place and carry it and deposit it someplace else. A flood that leaves no evidence is really a mythological flood. And so I don't know anyone today who holds to a global tranquil flood. And that leads to the 4th view, and that is the view of liberal theologians that the flood is a myth. If you believe in Santa Claus and the Tooth Fairy, you can believe in the flood, but it never happened. Just like the ancient Babylonians and the ancient Assyrians and the ancient Egyptians had flood myths, so did the Hebrews. Well, I'm not going to argue for the historicity of the flood tonight, but I want to present to you just a few of the biblical reasons for believing that it was a global catastrophe. First of all, consider the purpose of the flood. The purpose, listen carefully, the purpose of the flood was not to destroy sinful man. The purpose of the flood was not to destroy sinful man. Read the text of Genesis. Genesis 6. The Lord said, I will blot out man whom I have created from the face of the land, from man to animals to creeping things and to the birds of the sky, for I am sorry that I have made them. Verse 13. Then God said to Noah, the end of all flesh has come before me, for the earth is filled with violence because of them, and behold, I am about to destroy them with the earth. The purpose of the flood was not to destroy sinful man. The purpose was to destroy sinful man and all the land animals, and all the birds, and the earth itself. And only a global flood would fulfill that purpose. If the flood was localized, then it wouldn't kill all the animals and all the birds. The animals and the birds living in North America, South America, Europe, Asia, Africa, and Australia could care less whether there's a flood in the Middle East. Only a global flood will get all the animals. Secondly, the purpose of the ark. The purpose of the ark was not to save a few animals so Noah could start a farm after the flood. The purpose of the ark is very clearly spelled out in Genesis chapter 7. Then the Lord said to Noah, "Enter the ark, you and all your household, for you alone I have seen to be righteous before me in this time. You shall take with you of every clean animal by sevens, a male and his female, and of the animals that are not clean, 2, a male and his female, and also of the birds of the sky by sevens, male and female." Why? To keep offspring alive on the face of all the earth. If the flood was local, the ark was completely unnecessary. It was a ridiculous building project for God to give to Noah. All he'd have to do is say, "Hey, Noah, I'm letting you in on a secret. I'm going to send a flood in your area. Why don't you go on a long vacation to Europe?" The animals and the birds have no problem. Animals and birds often sense natural disaster coming, like a forest fire or something. They move out of the danger zone. Even if all of them were killed in the floodplain, in a local flood, animals living outside that would just migrate back in after the flood and repopulate the area. So there'd be no need for a flood. Only a global flood fits the purpose of the ark, because if it was global, there was no place for any creatures to survive. Then the volume of the ark speaks of a global catastrophe. Oftentimes in children's books, we see pictures of Noah's Ark that look something like this. But we've got to scratch this completely from our mind. Nothing could be farther from the truth. The Bible gives the dimensions of the ark. It was 1.5 football fields long. It was about 2/3 of a football field wide, and it was 4 stories tall. It had the capacity of about 560 railroad stock cars. And no boat, as far as we know, was built this big again until about 1860, although we have record of very large vessels built even before the time of Christ, after the flood. So this was a huge, huge boat. And many people will scoff and say, "Well, there's no way you could fit all of the animals onto the ark." And when they say this, it just shows that they've never done the very simple mathematics. So let's do a little of it to see just how ridiculous this really was or was not. How many animals were on the ark? Well, we have a few facts to take into account from the Genesis record. It tells us that Noah was to take 2 of each kind and 7 of the clean animals. Now, the word kind is very important. It is not the word species. It is not the word genus or family. It's not one of our modern taxonomical terms, but it is the biblical word kind. It's the same word that's used in Genesis 1, where God created the different plants and animals after their kinds. So he used to take 2 of every kind. Well, how big of a category is this biologically? We don't know for sure the genetic boundaries of the Genesis kind, but we have good reasons to think that the original kind was, of the dog kind, involved wolves, had the genetic information for wolves, coyotes, dingoes, jackals, and all the varieties of domestic dogs. So when Noah took 2 of the dogs onto the ark, he didn't have to take 2 poodles, 2 Great Danes, 2 Dachshunds. He took 2 of the dog kind that had the genetic information for producing all of this variety after the flood. So kind was certainly not a smaller category than modern species. But for this examination of this question, we're going to make it as hard as we can for Noah. We're going to say he has to take 2 of every species onto the ark. Well, how many species are there? Well, in classifications, we have mammals. There are approximately 3,700 species of mammals, so we'll put all of those on the ark. Now, he wouldn't take all of them on the ark because some mammals live in the ocean, like dolphins, and they're not bothered by floods. They live in the water all the time. Birds, 8,600 species. We'll put all of those on the ark. But some of the birds could have survived outside. Ducks live on the water, and so they potentially could have survived, but we'll put them all on the ark to make it as difficult for Noah as we can. Reptiles, 6,300 reptiles. We'll put them all on the ark. Amphibians, they spent a lot of time in the water, 2,500 species of amphibians. We'll put them all on the ark. Then the rest of the animals all live in the ocean, or they could survive on floating vegetation or in egg form, and so they wouldn't go on the ark. Noah was not told to take any sea creatures on the ark for obvious reasons. So none of those get counted. Let's total them up then. Most of the creatures of the earth live in the ocean or can survive in water, but Noah would have had to take less than 21,000 creatures on the ark. And then we total that up then. We've got 21,000, two of each of those. That's 42,000. We'll throw in 7,800 clean animals. That's probably way more than he would have needed. I think there's probably less than 1,000 clean animals, kinds. But we'll make it as hard as we can for Noah. That's a total of 50,000 animals on the ark. Now remember, we're talking species. Kinds was probably a bigger biological category, therefore the number of kinds would be much less than 50,000, but we're making it as tough as we can for Noah. Could we fit all those animals on the ark? Well, the first thing we need to bear in mind is that the average size of animals is about the size of a sheep. Some animals, like giraffe or elephant, are much bigger than that, but a lot of animals are much smaller than a sheep. Then, what about the larger animals? Well, why did Noah take them on the ark? It was so that they could repopulate the earth after the flood. So Noah would not take the largest ones because the largest ones would also be the oldest. This would particularly have bearing related to dinosaurs. He would not take Grandma and Grandpa elephant on the ark because they wouldn't have reproductive potential after the flood. Take teenager elephant on the ark. Then the size of the ark is given here in feet. It was given in the Bible in cubits, which is the distance from the tip of the elbow to the top of the hand, roughly 1.5 feet. And so we have the cubic feet. There were 3 levels. That's about capacity of about 560 railroad stock cars. One car holds 240 sheep. And you say, now wait a minute, Terry. You're packing those in there pretty tight. Well, let's remember, this was a survival journey. This was not a Caribbean cruise where each sheep gets its own private bathroom and kitchenette. Okay, well, we have 50,000 animals at 240 per stock car. That comes out to 208 stock cars, which is only 36% of the ark's capacity, leaving plenty of room for the plant matter that was also taken on the ark at God's command as food for Noah and his family. So there was plenty of room in the ark, and remember now, we're working with species. This is the worst case scenario. If kind was really a bigger genetic category than species, then the number of kinds on the ark was much less than 50,000. But then people still object and say, now wait a minute, you're not going to get those dinosaurs in the ark. Well, there are several factors to consider here. First of all, many of the dinosaurs were much smaller, even at their full size, than a sheep. And then there's the fact that all of the large dinosaurs started out small. The largest dinosaur egg that we have found is about the size of an English rugby football. And so, again, he would not have taken the big ones. And then the evolutionists are notorious for multiplying the number of species. This happens not only in dinosaur research, but also in the study of human evolution. Almost every fossil find gets a new species name, named often after the person who found them. So these are probably a case of multiplying species where there's really no distinction. Again, we see this diversity among dogs, but they're all the dog kind. And here's an example of the ceratopsia. This is probably all one kind, and this variation that we see here is actually less than the dog variation we saw in the previous diagram. So creation scientists believe there were probably only about 50 dinosaur kinds, and some of them were small. Well, there's another evidence of the global catastrophe, and that is the character of the flood. Back in the 19th century, when people were saying that the flood was not violent, they said, there's no evidence in the biblical text that it was a violent catastrophe. And when they said this, it just showed that they didn't read the English or the Hebrew very carefully. In Genesis chapter 7, we're told about the source of the water in the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, on the 17th day of the month. On the same day, all the fountains of the great deep burst open, and the floodgates of the sky were opened. So the most well-known source of the water was the floodgates of the sky. The next verse says it rained for 40 days and 40 nights. And I thought that that was all the time that it rained until I heard a paper by a Hebrew Old Testament scholar last year in which he argued, and you can go back to the text and look at this, but he argued from the Hebrew, but I think it's also seems clear from the English, that the reference to the 40 days and 40 nights of rain was the time period until the ark started to float, but that the rain actually continued nonstop up until the 150th day. But in any case, this was not a spring rain to water the garden. This was a rain as an expression of the holy wrath of God. This was monsoon rain, 24 hours a day and night, for at least 40 days, and all over the earth. It would have caused mudslides that would make the California mudslides look like a Sunday school picnic. But then the primary source of water seems to be from the fountains of the great deep bursting open, because they are the first thing mentioned. And this word, or what we have in English, burst open, is actually one Hebrew verb. The fountains of the great deep refer to subterranean waters. The great deep in the Bible usually refers to the ocean. So this is subterranean water coming in to the oceans. And we have lots and lots of subterranean water on the earth today. Most of our drinking water comes from underground water. And there's hot, briny water coming into the ocean floor even today. Now, burst open. This is a Hebrew word that is used several other places in the Old Testament, and it is loaded with geological significance. It is used in the book of Numbers when Korah rebels against Moses' leadership, and God says, I'm going to judge Korah, and I want the people of Israel to move away from Korah and his livestock and his people and his tents. And the scriptures say that the ground opened. It's the same Hebrew verb. And it was a small earthquake, and their tents and livestock and people went into the ground, and then the ground closed. It's the same word that's used in Judges when Samson was thirsty, and the rock split and water came out. It's the same verb that's used in Zechariah 14:4 when it talks about the second coming of the Messiah, and it says that the Lord's foot will touch the Mount of Olives, and the mountain will split in two, and a huge valley will form. So this verb is loaded with geological significance. It's telling us that the crust of the earth began to break apart all over the earth, and water came onto the earth under high pressure. Whenever we have a volcano or an earthquake on the bottom of the ocean today, it sets off tidal waves. These become what are known as tsunamis as they approach a landmass. And they can go for thousands of miles across the ocean floor at speeds up to 600 miles an hour. And when they rise up and reach the landmass, they can carry ships a mile inland and do incredible damage to the land. So we have evidence of violence at the beginning of the flood. But we also see evidence in the recessional phase of the flood. In Genesis 8:3, it says the waters receded steadily from the earth, and at the end of 150 days, the waters decreased. This adverb steadily is actually two verbs in the Hebrew, and they are two of the most common verbs in the Hebrew. They are the verb to go and the verb to return. So the waters, literally, the waters are receding, going, and returning in Hebrew. This is moving water. As the waters are receding, they're moving. What does moving water do? It carries sediments. And so in the recessional phase of the flood, the waters are going to be moving. Some of the sediments that were deposited in the first half of the flood are going to be moved somewhere else. Psalm 104 also alludes to the flood. Many people say this is a creation passage, this whole psalm. But I don't think so. I think if we look carefully at verses 8 and 9, it is talking about the flood. It says that the mountains rose and the valleys sank down to the place which you established for them. You set a boundary that they may not pass over, so that they will not return to cover the earth. If that's referring to the third day of creation when God made dry land, then the flood was a violation of that statement. I think that is a statement about the flood, and it tells us that the land mass, the crust of the earth shifted in the recessional stage of the flood, and so the mountains rose and the valleys sank. Now, if you combine earthquakes and volcanoes, like the earthquake that we saw in Turkey a few years ago, with floods, like the one in Nicaragua a few years ago, you are going to have a catastrophe of unimaginable magnitude. Now look at that water. Wouldn't you like to just take a cup and just scoop in there and get a drink? Why does it look so brown? It looks brown because it's carrying sediments. And if we could do a stop-action cut through that water, we would find that that water is not just carrying microscopic particles of silt and maybe some sand grains, it's carrying boulders. And that house didn't last very long, I'm sure. And so the flood was a violent, violent catastrophe. All of the plant materials ripped up off the land. All the land creatures were drowned in the flood, taken from whatever they were hanging on to, and there was massive, massive erosion and sedimentation going on. Then there's the depth of the flood. The Bible tells us how deep it was in Genesis 7. It says, the waters prevailed more and more upon the earth, so that all the high mountains everywhere under the heavens were covered. The water prevailed 15 cubits higher, and the mountains were covered. Now, let's suppose that we're all mountains in here, and let's suppose that this little thing here is like Elijah's jar, or was it Elisha, the jar of oil that never ran out, and I start pouring water on the mountains down here. What's going to happen? Well, the water's just going to pile up on top of their head, isn't it? No. It's water seeks a level plain. It's going to run down the shoulders. And so if I want to cover this mountain, I'm going to have to cover a lot of other mountains. But I'm a mountain too, so I've got to keep pouring to cover me. But we got a problem. The doors in the auditorium here are not watertight. The water's going to leak out the doors. It's going to go down the road to the campground here. And then it's going to go down the roads to Harrison. And so I'm going to have to pour a lot of water just to get this mountain covered. The only way to get all the high mountains under heaven covered is a global flood. Those who believe in a local flood believe that it was in the Mesopotamian valley. And to believe in a local flood, you've got to believe in something like this. Now, this is not an actual photograph. This is an artistic design by one of our artists in our office. No such flood really exists in the world, never has. The only way you could have a flood like this is if God put his hands around all that water and kept it all contained. There's a problem with that view, though. There's nothing in the text of Genesis that says God did any kind of supernatural action like that. On the contrary, the whole text of the flood account is going out of its way to tell us he didn't do anything like that he was destroying the whole world. Then finally, for this discussion, the rainbow promise. In Genesis 9, we have the promise that God will never again send a flood on the earth, and the rainbow is the sign of that promise. This passage is one of those passages that causes me to think, you know, Lord, the Bible is awful long, and it takes a lot to read it. It would help if you'd not repeat yourself, you know. Just put it down once and then we can get on to the next topic. But if you read this passage, God repeats himself over and over and over again. And that should lead us to a very important Bible study principle. That is, if God repeats himself, you should say, I think he's trying to emphasize something. And who did God make the promise to? He did not make the promise to Noah. He made the promise to Noah and all of his descendants, the animals and all their offspring, the birds and all their offsprings, and he made the promise to the earth itself. If the flood was local, God lied. Because there have been many local floods that have destroyed some animals and some people and some of the earth. But only a global flood fits the rainbow promise. When God said he would never destroy the earth again, that is exactly what he meant. And therefore, every time we see a rainbow, we should remember that God flooded this world with a global flood. It should be a sober reminder to us of a historical event. Now, what would you expect from a global flood that lasted 371 days from the day that Noah got on the ark until the day he and the animals came off the ark, as it's described in Genesis? Well, you should expect to find billions of dead things buried in rock layers that were once soft sediments laid down by water. And you should expect to find that all over the earth. And that's precisely what we find. Billions of dead things buried in rock layers laid down by water all over the earth. But that rock layer of fossils is a record of death. The evolutionists tell us that's the evidence of millions of years. So you can't really believe in Noah's flood as a global catastrophe and believe in millions of years at the same time. Because if the evidence is evidence of millions of years, if the rock record is evidence of millions of years, then it can't be evidence of Noah's flood. And if it's evidence of Noah's flood, it can't be evidence of millions of years. Now, there are theologians and Bible scholars out there who believe in both a global flood and millions of years, but they haven't thought the issue through. They're being inconsistent. They don't understand the significance of the geological record. Now, let's look at the geology. And to do that, I want to take you back first to the 19th century to help you understand the geology. And in the early 19th century is when the idea of millions of years was born. Up until that time, the biblical and traditional view, which was defended by a group of men that I studied in my PhD called the scriptural geologists, they believed what had been believed for 18 centuries in the church, and that was that there was a supernatural creation week, SCW, and God created everything in 6 literal days about 6,000 years ago, and that was followed about 1,600 years later by the flood, and then things continued up to P, the present time, and then they believed that there would be a supernatural ending, SE, to the world when Jesus Christ came again. That view was replaced in the early 19th century, first by the catastrophist view. There were 2 very influential men in development of that view, Cuvier and Smith, a Frenchman and an Englishman, respectively. And they believed in a supernatural beginning. They believed in God, but they didn't believe the biblical account of history. And so they imagined that over the course of untold ages, millions of years, every so often there was a regional or global catastrophe that destroyed much of the earth and much of the life on the earth. And then after each catastrophe, God supernaturally created new forms of life to replace the creatures that had died in that catastrophe. And then things went along for long ages, and then there was another regional or global catastrophe. So this was the catastrophist view. And because they viewed these catastrophes as natural, there might be a future catastrophe of this magnitude. And they maybe believed in a natural ending, but their writings don't really indicate what they believed about the future. That view reigned in geology for about 30 years. But by about 1830, it was replaced by the uniformitarian view. And this view said there have been no regional or global catastrophes in Earth history. The processes of geological change have been uniform all throughout history. Now, the uniformitarians maybe believed in a supernatural beginning. Some of them maybe didn't even believe that there was a beginning, believed in an eternal Earth, but they didn't talk about that very much. But you see, there are no seas on the line. Earthquake here, a volcano there, a small flood here, just like we see on average during the course of a year today. Those have happened all throughout history. And the uniformitarian view, by about 1840, became the ruling dogma of geology. About 1840 is when geology became a profession. That's about the time that you were able, for the first time in history, to get a degree at the university in geology. And so from that time on, everybody was trained with a uniformitarian view of Earth history. And the journals, the science journals, the geological associations were controlled by this uniformitarian view. Now, I say all that so that you can understand this quote that I'm going to read to you by an evolutionary geologist who died just a few years ago. And I'm quoting from a book in which a few pages before this quote, he actually warned people like me, young Earth creationists, from using anything in his book to support my view. But Dr. Ager is dead now, and so I don't really care what he thinks. And what's truth is truth. What's good for the goose is good for the gander, so I'm going to use it anyway. And he now knows his views are wrong anyway. So he's talking about the stratigraphic record, the nature of the strata. And he's got a chapter in there on the history of the early 19th century in geology, and he makes this statement. As far as I can tell from his writings, he was an atheist until his death. My excuse for this lengthy and amateur digression into history is that I've been trying to show how I think geology got into the hands of the theoreticians, in his mind those were the uniformitarians, who were conditioned by the social and political history of their day more than by observations in the field. Now that is a very significant statement. He's saying, and I think he's right, that the uniformitarians were controlled and influenced in their interpretation of the rocks more by social and political ideas than by the actual rocks themselves. He goes on to say this. In other words, and he's writing to his fellow evolutionary geologists, we have allowed ourselves to be, what's that word? Brainwashed. That's not my word, that's his word. Brainwashed into avoiding any interpretation of the past that involves extreme or what might be termed catastrophic processes. So here's what he's saying. I took geology in high school, and I learned it with a uniformitarian perspective. I went to undergraduate. I learned geology from a uniformitarian perspective. I went on to get my PhD, taught by uniformitarian geologists. I went out and looked at the rocks, and I was thinking like a uniformitarian. But Dr. Ager was a world-class geologist. He studied on-location geological formations in over 50 countries. And the more he looked at the rocks, the more he began to say, these rocks are screaming catastrophe. The way I was trained to think in school was wrong. I was brainwashed. The evidence of catastrophe was always there, but I couldn't see it because of this brainwashing. Let me illustrate. What's missing in this picture? What was it originally? I'll give you a moment to think about that, and then we'll have a little quiz, okay? Was the original picture A? Anybody want to vote for A? Okay? How about B? Was that what the picture was originally? C? Anybody want to vote for that one? Okay? This is what most of you will probably vote for, as my past experience would suggest. Was that it? Yeah. Nope. The answer is nothing is missing. It was drawn that way. Now what happened? I brainwashed you. I brainwashed you by asking a simple question. What's missing? And what I did was I influenced your mind to think something is missing. I got to figure out what's missing because you asked the question. I brainwashed you. I got you to think the way I wanted you to think. So, we all have the same facts. The evolutionists and the creationist geologists, they have the same Grand Canyon, they have the same fossils, they have the same rock formations, but depending on the starting assumptions will affect not only what you see, but how you interpret what you see. So, Dr. Ager is saying, I was brainwashed with a uniformitarian view, set of assumptions, slow, gradual processes, no catastrophes in Earth history of regional or global magnitude. And so when I went out and looked at the rocks, I couldn't see any evidence of catastrophe. But it was more and more observations of the real world that began to show him that the assumptions were wrong. And so he says, if you go out without ruling out a regional or global catastrophe before you ever look at the evidence, you'll actually see the evidence. Now, these kinds of geologists are called neo-catastrophists. Neo from Latin for new. And they are going back to some of the ideas of the early 19th century catastrophists. Now, the neo-catastrophists are still evolutionists. They still believe in millions of years. So they say, you know, if you look at that bottom layer there, let's say that shale, and if you don't look at it with uniformitarian assumptions, you will see evidence in that rock formation that it was formed catastrophically, rapidly. And then if you look at this next layer, let's say it's sandstone, and you look at it without uniformitarian assumptions, without ruling out catastrophe on a very high level, before you ever look at the rocks, you'll actually see evidence in the rock layers that they were laid down catastrophically, rapidly. And if you look at the next layer, the same will be the case. And so they see this evidence of catastrophe. Dr. Ager said that much of the geological record shows evidence of catastrophic formation, but he still believes in the millions of years. So where do they put the time? In between the layers, where there is no evidence. That's convenient. Now, the creationist geologists come along and say, now, you neo-catastrophists are on the right track. There is evidence in those layers that they were formed catastrophically and rapidly. But if you didn't start, you neo-catastrophists, if you didn't start with the anti-biblical assumption that ruled out a global flood before you ever started to look at the evidence, and if you looked more carefully at that boundary, you would see that there's no evidence of long passages of millions or thousands of years. There's evidence that this was laid down in rapid succession. Let me give you just one example. Here is a cross-section of the southwest United States where the Grand Canyon is located. Here's the Grand Canyon, and when you stand at the Grand Canyon, you see those rock layers on the other side, and they look just like pancakes. And we can trace those rock layers for hundreds, in some cases thousands of miles, and they're just as flat as pancakes. But look at the topography of the southwest United States. We see not only this huge canyon, which is 4 to 18 miles wide and 270 miles long and a mile deep, but we see these other erosional features that look like the ancient shorelines of a huge lake or ocean. But look at those layers in the canyon. We don't see any of those features, which we would expect to see if there was a long passage of time. Now, how long does it take to make fossils? Let's talk about that for a moment. Here's an interesting statement from some evolutionists, no friends of creation or the Bible. They say in a book on dinosaurs, fossilization is a process that can take anything from a few hours to millions of years. Now, stop right there and think. One of the things you have to do as you read what evolutionists say is you need to read the sentence and then you need to back up and read it again more slowly. How do they know that fossilization can take millions of years? Has any geologist lived long enough to observe that as empirical observational science? Well, of course not. Has the science of geology been in existence long enough that you could string together overlapping careers of scientists so they could all share their notebooks and say, we've observed empirically that it takes millions of years for a fossil to form? No, the science of geology has only been in existence about 200 years. So how do they know it takes millions of years for fossilization to happen? The answer is they don't. It's an assumption. It's a belief. Well, how do they know it takes a few hours? Now we're on to empirical observational science. They go on to say, the amount of time that it takes for a bone to become completely permineralized is highly variable. If the groundwater is heavily laden with minerals in solution, the process can happen rapidly. Modern bones that fall into mineral springs can become permineralized within a matter of weeks. Well, now Noah's flood was 4,000 years ago. And what would we have with Noah's flood? We would have groundwater heavily laden with minerals as the land is being ripped up and pulverized. We need to understand that fossils do not come with labels on them saying how old they are. The scientists have to infer that from other evidence. But there's lots of evidence in the fossil record that fossils form rapidly. Here is some interesting evidence. An ichthyosaur fossilized in the act of giving birth. This creature was swimming along and didn't know it, but a wave was coming along in the ocean, choked with sediments, buried this creature alive, cut it off from scavengers, micro-decay organisms, and those sediments were quickly turned to stone. Or look at the fish caught in the act of eating its lunch. Fish decompose very rapidly, and yet we find many, many examples of fish not only preserved in the skeletal form, but even the soft parts, the fins, are preserved. This speaks of very rapid burial. Or consider jellyfish. I mean, they don't have any hard parts at all. And when jellyfish are in storms, they will often be washed up onto the shore. And when they're washed up onto the shore, they are in a fight for survival. And they start pumping on the sand to try to get ready for the next wave that will wash up so that they can go back into the ocean. A couple of years ago, geologists found a formation in Wisconsin that had thousands of jellyfish fossils in the layers, along with these ripple marks, both very transitory features. And they look just exactly like the impressions that are made by modern jellyfish pumping on a beach to survive. This speaks of rapid burial and rapid fossilization. We also see evidence of fossil graveyards. For example, the Karoo Formation in Africa, where 800 billion vertebrates estimated are buried together, all messed up. This is not where they lived. This is where they were buried. Or consider the formation in Florissant, Colorado. Shell creatures, some fish and birds, and hundreds of species of plants and insects are all buried together in one location. They didn't all live together when they were alive, but they're buried together. And then there's the formation in Agate Springs, Nebraska, which is what this picture is from. And here we find thousands of fossils of rhinoceros, camels, giant boars, and other exotic animals, none of which live in Nebraska today, and they're all mixed together. They're not buried where they live, they're buried where they're buried. And they're not buried where they just fell over and expired and died. Some catastrophe mingled all these bones together. Well, how long does it take rocks to form and to erode? When I was working on my PhD in England, I came across an article in a newspaper in Norfolk, England, on the east side of England, and a very interesting article called Magic in the Marsh. And it talked about some geological research being done on the coast there, and it said, without any regard to the laws of geology, mud on the marsh is hardening into stone in a few years rather than the thousands it usually takes. Now there it is again. Now how do they know it usually takes thousands of years for rock to form? The answer is they don't. It's an assumption. But now reality is going to blow the assumption. It goes on to say, Professor Coleman, the lead geologist on this research, said the rock was forming faster than anybody had ever believed possible. You see what the problem was? It was beliefs. With one stone creating itself in just 6 months. They often contain beautifully preserved fossils where the detail of the soft flesh of the creature is caught, as well as the bone, as it had no time to rot before the rock formed around it. It doesn't take millions of years to form rock. All it takes is the right chemicals in the water. Now, what's causing the rock formation here? Well, they studied this, and they found that it was bacteria in the mud that were eating things in the mud and then excreting their waste product, which was producing the cementing agents that turn the mud into stone. Here's an interesting example of the power of preconceived ideas. The Scablands out in eastern Washington, covering an area of 15,000 square miles, beautiful area of valleys and waterfalls, and for many, many decades, if you would check the literature, would have gone here and talked to a national park ranger, they would have said that this formation was formed over many, many millions of years by stream erosion. But if you go to a website today on the Scablands, you will be informed that this was all formed by floodwaters in 1 to 2 days. And here's where they think all the water came from. It was the dark region there is the Scablands area, and then up in Idaho and Montana, They believe there's strong evidence for what they believe was a glacial lake that was stopped up by a natural dam. That dam, maybe perhaps ice, gave way, and this whole lake just flooded through there and carved that formation in 1 to 2 days. There's an interesting article on the history of the interpretation of the Scablands that was done by Dr. Stephen Jay Gould, a leading evolutionist at Harvard University who died a couple of years ago, one of the more honest evolutionists. And he talked about the debate about the formation of this area. There was a gentleman, a field geologist by the name of J. Harlan Bretz, who he was not in the hallowed halls of academia. He was a field geologist out there walking among the rocks, and he was convinced that this was formed catastrophically. And he wrote some journal articles in the 1920s and 30s, and most of the geological establishment just ignored what he had to say, first of all, because he didn't have any explanation for where the water came from. But another geologist eventually found the evidence for this Lake Missoula, as it's been called, and yet the scientific establishment still rejected his views. And here's what Stephen Jay Gould had to say about this. The establishment, as represented by the United States Geological Society, closed ranks in opposition. Instead of testing Brett's flood on its own merits, they rejected it on general principles. You see what's happening? They didn't go out and look at the rocks and see what Bretz was seeing. They just rejected his theory on general principles, uniformitarian assumptions. Gould goes on to say, Bretz stood against a firm and highly restrictive, what's that word? Dogma. I thought dogma was only in religion and theology. No, dogma is in science. It's also called a paradigm. He says, he was standing against a restrictive dogma that never had made any sense. The emperor had been naked for a century. Charles Lyell, the godfather of geological gradualism or uniformitarianism, had pulled a fast one in establishing the doctrine of imperceptible change. Now we see examples of the incredible erosive power of water in many places today. Here's just an average flood in Canyon Lake Spillway in Texas in 2002. The water in this picture is moving at 107,000 cubic feet per second, which is 600 times faster than normal. Now, I wonder what kind of damage that would do. Well, we found out after the flood subsided. Here was some of the damage. Ripped right through that highway and cut down through solid rock. And here's a picture of some of the boulders that water was carrying. And there's a man in the background for scale. Look at the size of those rocks. Moving water can carry rocks the size of cars if it's moving fast enough. And what happens when the water is carrying rocks like that is that they act like jackhammers, hammering on the bed of whatever surface it's going over and just pulverizing and breaking up more. Incredible destruction of moving water. For many, many decades, the National Park Service at the Grand Canyon said the Colorado River cut the Grand Canyon, just slowly, a little bit at a time, just a grain of sand, a grain of limestone at a time, over millions and millions of years. But that idea is just ridiculous, really, when we look at the whole canyon. Here is the Colorado River Valley right here. I had the privilege of going on a raft trip down the Grand Canyon, and then we walked out on the way out, and I walked out on Bright Angel Trail. But look at this canyon, 4 to 18 miles wide. You can't say the Colorado River cut all that unless you redefine what you mean by Colorado River. You got to have water carving through all of that. It looks a lot more like a whole lot of water in a short period of time rather than a little bit of water over a long period of time. And that's what many, many geologists, including even evolutionary geologists who are acquainted firsthand with the Grand Canyon, are saying. Here's an interesting statement. From 1924 to 1988, there was a visitor sign above the entrance to Carlsbad Caverns that said Carlsbad was at least 260 million years old. In 1988, the sign was changed to read 7 to 10 million years old. Then for a little while, the sign read that it was 2 million years old. Now the sign is gone. Now what's going on here? The caverns are not getting younger from 1924 to 1998. They're getting older by about 60 years. So what's happening? What's happening is that the cave is blowing the assumptions of the geologists out of the water. They're watching these stalactites and the stalagmites, and they're making other observations, and they're saying, we made some wrong assumptions about how long it takes these things to form. And now they're not sure. Well, what about radiometric dating methods? You know, carbon-14, rubidium, strontium, potassium, argon, uranium, lead. Most of the world has been led to believe that these are foolproof methods that prove millions of years, but they don't. The first thing we need to know about these dating methods is that in general, dates in the correct ballpark are assumed to be correct and are published, but those in disagreement with other data are seldom published, nor are the discrepancies fully explained. So now you know that when you read a newspaper article or a magazine article, like Time or Newsweek, and they talk about the fact that these fossils have been dated in rock layers that are X million years old, now you know that the published date was a selected date. It wasn't all the dates they got when they applied the dating methods to those rocks. Let me give you an example. Mount St. Helens was a beautiful mountain in 1980, in early 1980. There were boats sailing on there, but on May 18th, 1980, there was nobody sailing on that mountain because the geologists knew from observations over several years that this mountain was ready to blow its top. And it did at about 8:30 in the morning. About 1/3 of the volcano was removed by the explosion, and in the top of the crater in the volcano, a lava dome began to develop as lava continued to ooze into the crater. Here's a view of the mountain from the top, and there we see the crater in the middle. And Dr. Steve Austin from the Institute for Creation Research went up to the top of the mountain to collect samples of this lava to send it off to the laboratories to date with these radiometric dating methods. Now, he got his degree at Penn State University. He trained under some of the leading evolutionary geologists. They taught him how to take proper rock samples. They taught him how to prepare them to send them to the laboratory for dating. So he did all that, and he asked them to give the dates for the rock. And they applied 4 different methods on these rocks, and the results came back that these rocks were 340,000 to 2.8 million years old. Now, what are these radiometric dates telling us? They're telling us the time that it was from the present back to the time that the rocks crystallized from the molten lava state to become solid rock. But we know when that happened because we know when the volcano erupted. And these rocks are actually less than 25 years old because the rocks formed after the volcano blew its top. Now, evolutionists will often say, well, we will admit that the radiometric dating methods are not absolutely correct. They're off by a little bit, but they're not off by millions of years. Oh, yes, they are. And this is not the only example. We find many examples published in the literature of rocks of known age where the lava came out in recent times. There were eyewitnesses to record when this happened, and when we apply the dating methods to those rocks, the methods don't work. They give clearly erroneous dates. And yet the evolutionists want to say that when they apply the dating methods to rocks of unknown age, in other words, rocks that formed when there were no human observers, so we don't know by eyewitness testimony when they were formed, they want us to assume that the dating methods work then. That is not a good thing to assume. Creation scientists have been working on this question for a number of years in a group called the RATE Group. And back in August of 2003 on our website, answersingenesis.org, there was a layman's summary of some very recent, exciting research. And if you just type the word RATE, R-A-T-E, into the search engine and look for the article, which will probably be the first article that pops up, RATE Group reveals exciting breakthroughs, you can read in layman's terms about that exciting research. And then in the first or second footnote, there are links to the Institute for Creation Research website where you can read the technical articles. So, we look at the rocks of the earth, and the evolutionists tell us that these rocks formed over millions and millions of years. The evolutionists say that mile-deep pile in the Grand Canyon was at least 300 million years, and then it was more millions of years to carve out the Grand Canyon. But it's not the witness to millions of years. It is actually the witness to Noah's flood. A catastrophe of unimaginable magnitude that destroyed the earth and laid down sediments, burying creatures alive in those sediments. But the evolutionists don't believe in a global flood on the earth, but they do believe in a global flood. A flood of biblical proportions, enough to fill the Mediterranean Sea. Well, we know that's not the biblical proportions, but it gushed down from the highlands of Mars 1 billion or so years ago. The latest pictures from the Pathfinder confirmed on Monday. The total release of gases from Tharsis magma may have produced the equivalent of a global layer of water nearly 400 feet deep. At the end of the Noachian epoch, they even call this after Noah's name. Volcanic activity dissipated. But they've got the flood on the wrong planet. Now, this is really difficult for people to understand. How can brilliant scientists at NASA and other places believe in a flood on Mars where to date there is no evidence of even a single drop of liquid water? And yet they scoff at creationists for believing in a global flood on planet Earth that is 70% covered with liquid water. And then they say, well, where did all the water come from? And where did it all go to? Well, all you have to do is flatten out the land masses of the earth and raise the ocean basins, and there's enough water in our oceans to flood the earth to a depth of 3 kilometers. There's plenty of water on this planet. How can these brilliant scientists, who compared to me, compared to them, I'm a mental midget. How can they believe in a flood on Mars and not believe in a flood on the earth? It's not an issue of intelligence. I'll give you several explanations. Romans 1. For even though they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks, but they became futile in their speculations, and their foolish heart was darkened. Professing to be wise, they became fools. Or John 3. Jesus said, this is the judgment, that the light has come into the world, and men love the darkness rather than the light, for their deeds were evil. For everyone who does evil hates the light and does not come to the light for fear that his deeds will be exposed. The Bible teaches that sin darkens the mind. Sin distorts our thinking. And the more that our mind is thinking about the really important questions of life, like, why am I here? Where did I come from? Is there a God? What happens to me after I die? The more my mind is thinking about those questions, the more sin will darken my understanding, unless I am willing to submit to the one who made me. 2 Peter says this, first of all, you must understand that in the last days, scoffers will come, scoffing and following their own evil desires. They will say, where is this coming he promised? Ever since our fathers died, everything goes on as it has since the beginning of creation. The Apostle Peter was an ignorant fisherman, never went to university, never studied geology. But the sentence in yellow, written almost 2,000 years ago, is a perfect layman's summary of the uniformitarian assumption of Charles Lyell. All things continue just as they have since the beginning of creation. And Peter goes on to say, when they say this, and when they deny the second coming, and they argue this way about the past, he says, they say this because they deliberately forget, or as the King James says, they are willfully ignorant of the fact that long ago by God's word, 2 things. The heavens existed and the earth was formed out of water and by water, and by these waters, secondly, the world of that time was deluged and destroyed. So Peter says the reason people will think about, reject the second coming and think in this uniformitarian way is because they have rejected the supernatural creation and Noah's flood. Well, those are the biblical explanations for how highly intelligent and highly educated people can believe in a flood on Mars, but not a flood on Earth. But I'll put the words to you that Derek Yeager told us before. We've allowed ourselves to be brainwashed. We've all been brainwashed. The world has been brainwashed Derek Eger's talking about himself as a geologist. If the geologists have been brainwashed, then all of us lay people have been brainwashed. And that also means that all of our Bible scholars and theologians have been brainwashed because they've been raised in the same educational system. They've watched the same science programs on television. They've gone to the same national parks and museums. And that's what is actually happening. Here is a quote from Gleason Archer, a very respected, justly respected Old Testament scholar at the seminary that I went to, just died a few weeks ago. And he said, from a superficial reading of Genesis 1, the impression would seem to be that the entire creative process took place in 6 24-hour days. If this was the true intent of the Hebrew author, but he doesn't believe that. He believes in the day-age theory that God created over millions and millions of years. And he believed in a global flood, at least at the end of his life. In the later editions of this book, in the earlier editions, it's not clear whether he believed in a global flood. But why does he not accept what the, not only superficial, but also the plain reading under careful investigation of Genesis 1? Why doesn't he believe that? He says, this seems to run counter to modern scientific research, which indicates that the planet Earth was created several billion years ago. Why does he think that? Because he was brainwashed, just like all the rest of us. So the issue here about the age of the earth and about Noah's flood is not really an issue of science. It's not even an issue of time. It's not that God is somehow opposed to big numbers. He just doesn't feel comfortable with something like 15 billion. He likes 6,000 is a nicer number to him. It's not that God doesn't like time. It's what the evolutionists say happened in those millions and billions of years. That's the problem. And the issue is really that we're looking at the rocks from two different perspectives, with two different sets of assumptions. The secular historical view is really based on an atheistic view of the world, and so it's ruled out the flood before it's ever looked at the evidence. But if you look at the same rocks with a biblical understanding of history, you will see that they confirm what the Bible says. So the real issue here is, what is our authority? Is our authority the infallible Word of God, who was there at the beginning, who knows everything, who always tells the truth, who never makes mistakes, who inspired men to write the Scriptures without error? Or do we believe the fallible opinions of sinful men who are not only fallible, but they actually do make mistakes? They weren't there at the beginning. They don't know everything. And the evidence that they make mistakes is they have to keep republishing their science textbooks and revising them because of the errors in the last edition. And they're men who are sinful. They're in rebellion against their Creator, trying to find a way to explain the world without God so they do not have to be accountable to Him. Who are we going to believe? And I've noticed a very interesting thing, that whenever people try to harmonize the evolutionary theory or the idea of millions of years with the Bible, this is what always happens. The Bible gets cut and pasted, and evolution theory or the old earth theory remains unquestioned. But I would submit to you that cutting and pasting the Bible, leaving this verse out, moving this verse over here to make it fit, is not the proper way to treat the Bible. That is Bible mutilation. That is not Bible interpretation. So what we're involved in here is really a conflict of worldviews. The non-Christian worldview looks at the world through a set of lenses. The lens of death and bloodshed and suffering and disease, that's all normal. That's always been around. The lens of millions of years, and then the lens of man's existence, that he's a product of change, random change over millions and millions of years. And when a person looks at the world through those lenses, he gets a distorted view. He doesn't see the world clearly. Now, he sees some things accurately, but other things he doesn't see. Let me give you an illustration. A couple of years ago, I got bifocals. And I had them for a week, and I went back to the doctor, so frustrated, I said, just give me my old glasses back. And then I waited another year, and I was getting where I couldn't read my Bible with my glasses on or my glasses off. I couldn't screw a screw into the wall with my screwdriver because I couldn't see the screw no matter how far away I was. And I was so frustrated, I went back and I got bifocals. And so now, I can look at the people in the back of the room through the bottom of my glasses, and I can say with absolute scientific certainty that they have heads, but they do not have eyeballs. You see? I mean, if you could see what I can see, it's just obvious. It's a scientific fact. But when I look through my top lenses, oh, they have heads and eyeballs and noses and mouths. You see, the problem was my lenses didn't allow me to see everything, and so I made a wrong interpretation. Well, the Christian worldview is different. We have what we call the 7 C's of history. Creation, God made a perfect world in 6 literal days. Corruption, man fell in sin, rebelled against his Creator. That brought death into God's creation. The whole cosmos was damaged by sin and God's judgment. Catastrophe, Noah's flood. Confusion, the Tower of Babel, the splitting up of the single people group in the post-flood world into different people groups and different languages, which became the nations. And then Christ, the cross, and the consummation when Christ returns, and there's a new heavens and a new earth where there will be no more death. But there's a problem. There are a lot of people in the Christian world today who are really concerned about the fact that many, many Christians do not have a Christian worldview. And they're writing books about the Christian worldview and contending for the Christian worldview. The only problem is many of these authors don't have a fully Christian worldview, because many of them either ignore or reject the first 4 lenses in this telescope. And I submit to you that is not the Christian worldview. The Christian worldview does not start with Christ. It starts with creation. And so what we have here is really a partially biblical worldview. And when you have a partially biblical worldview, you also don't see the world as clearly, as sharply. You can't make sense of some of the things. And so to have a really biblical and Christian worldview, we need to have all of the 7 lenses. And then we can see the world clearly, whether it's the world of rocks, the world of living things, the world of nations, the world of different skin colors, the world of politics, the world of violence and crime and disease. Whatever it is, we can make sense of the world that we live in. You know, a lot of Christians believe in millions of years, and what they don't realize, most of them, is that they're believing that Adam and Eve were created in the Garden of Eden, but under the grass of the Garden of Eden was this pile of thousands of feet of sedimentary rock containing all these fossils as a testimony to death and disease, which the evolutionists say is the record of millions of years. But I submit to you that is absolutely contradictory to what the Bible says about death. The real picture is this. That pile of sedimentary rocks is largely the record of Noah's flood that came 1,600 years after Adam and Eve lived and sinned. I want to close with a verse from Matthew. Jesus talked about the flood. He said, "For the coming of the Son of Man will be just like the days of Noah. For as in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking and marrying and giving in marriage until the day that Noah entered the ark. And they did not understand until the flood came and took them away. So will be the coming of the Son of Man." Jesus clearly believed in Noah's flood, and he said Noah's flood is a sober warning of the coming judgment. Now, what if I said to you, just as Santa Claus came last year and brought Christmas presents for everybody in your family, so Jesus is coming again? Would you believe in the second coming? I hope not. I hope I haven't offended anyone. Santa Claus isn't really real, and he didn't really bring presents last year to your family. You would think in your mind, okay, Santa Claus isn't really real, so this Jesus coming again isn't really real either. But if I said to you, just as terrorists struck the Twin Towers in New York in September 11th, so Jesus is coming again, what are you going to think? Well, that event really happened, and so that event is going to really happen. So the coming judgment is like the judgment at Noah's flood. And just as there was only one door into the ark, and there was only one ark of salvation, so there's only one way of salvation from that coming judgment. And Jesus said, "I am the door. By me, if any man enter in, he shall be saved, and he shall go in and out and find pasture." Noah's flood is critical not only to understanding the rocks of the earth, it is critical to understanding what's going to happen in the future. And we will all stand before our Creator, who will be our judge. And our only hope is the cross of Christ. God bless you.